Welcome to Sparks of History, where world history and Jewish history meet. We are extremely pleased to have with us today Professor John Hosler. Professor Hosler earned his Ph.D. in history from the University of Delaware and is also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Professor Hosler's areas of expertise include medieval warfare, the Crusades, and military history. Professor Hosler teaches military history at the Army Command and General Staff College, located in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Dr. Hosler has written and edited numerous books, including but not limited to 7 Myths of Military History, The Siege of Acre, 1189-1191, Saladin, Richard the Lionheart, and the Battle that Decided the Third Crusade, Military Cultures and Martial Enterprises in the Middle Ages, Where Heaven and Earth Meet, Essays on Medieval Europe. And today we will be discussing the very fascinating Jerusalem Falls, 7 Centuries of Conflict and Resolution in the Middle Ages. It's a wonderful book, really comprehensive, covering all of those 7 centuries where one gets a real picture of what happened, what Jerusalem was all about in those years, and urge all of our listeners and viewers, as I did, to simply go on to Amazon, click of a button, free delivery, nothing better, and it's all yours. Professor Hosler, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Okay. Just to begin, what period, we said 7 centuries, but what period of time does your book cover, and why was that chosen by you?
The book covers the 7th century. I really start in the year 614 and go all the way into about the late 13th century, including the book in about the 1270s, 1280s. And the reason for doing that, it was deliberate. I wanted to look at what I believe are the real formative centuries of medieval Jerusalem, where the major events were happening, and you have sort of the most notable and important shifts in terms of events. And also, I wanted to start after the ancient period, and that was a deliberate choice. In my reading, there's been an awful lot written about Jerusalem in the ancient world for obvious and understandable reasons. But that not much had been done on the early years in terms of getting that history out to a wider audience. So I wanted to start early, but not too early. And the 7th century became a good place to do it because you have really probably the most momentous event in Jerusalem in the 7th century after what had happened at the hands of Titus in 70 AD, and that's the coming of Islam to the city. And that's an early 7th century story. So I figured that was probably a good place to start. And then to conclude it right before Ottoman rule in the time of the Mamluks, where I felt that, having gone on for, some 600 some years, that was a good comprehensible story I could tell. And that the Ottoman period is really, again, something separate, something that really deserves its own analysis and has gotten it in other works. And so I wanted that sweet spot in between things that had been highly talked about, so I could center on the more obscure things.
Okay. So as you mentioned, emerging Islamic faith, just a little bit of background on that development. From whom did the emerging Muslims capture Jerusalem in the 7th century?
Yeah, the Jerusalem in the 7th century, in the early 7th century, is a Byzantine frontier city. It is not quite at the very edge of the frontier with Arabia, but pretty close. And this is the area that the first Arabic raiders really start to range into following the death of Muhammad in 632. And they start by moving northward, and there's some localized fighting that's going on, and what becomes known as the Ridda Wars between the Arabs, and then eventually penetrations into the Levant in towards Syria, of these groups from the first caliphates, of the first successors of Muhammad, first under Abu Bakr and then under Umar. And those are really where you get the first concentrated contacts between the Byzantine and this new Islamic world that Muhammad created. And you have some fighting that goes on in the very beginning in the 630s, which begins with small scale raids, movements against villages and towns, and eventually full-scale warfare by the time you get to the year 635 and especially 636. So we're talking about just 4 years after Muhammad's death. Very, very serious fighting going on in the region between what you might call sort of an upstart newcomer for the world stage, and Arabia that had always had a significant population, but now was part of it was seemingly united under the banners of Islam, and the Byzantine Empire, which is one of the foremost political entities on the world stage at that time, one of the heavy hitters that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean region, lands in Asia Minor stretching around Egypt and the Maghreb, so that's the region that the Arabs are penetrating into. And I should point out, just beyond that, not under their control at the time, is the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Persians, which had actually occupied Jerusalem in the year 614. They had attacked it when, fought the Byzantine garrison that was in there, temporarily taking control of the city, but it had been recaptured by the Byzantines. So what you're setting up here is a principal power of the Mediterranean region, the Byzantine Empire, the old Eastern Roman Empire from days before, and this newcomer propelling itself forward with a speed and ferocity that had not really been seen from any of the major entities in the region up till that point. And so the Byzantines have to respond very, very quickly to these new incursions, and it leads to an extended period of warfare in the mid to late 630s.
This is an organized Islamic army, or are they still the underdog taking the Byzantines by surprise? And is there a strategic value to Jerusalem at this point, or is it just one of the cities that's under Byzantine control, and to take over from the Byzantines, it's one city that you got to take?
I would say it's a little of both. They are the underdogs to an extent that because they're newly fashioned. It's a coalition of some groups that have been recently undergone religious conversion, and so it's very new, and nobody would have bet on them. Certainly, we have correspondences between the early Muslims and the Byzantines, in which essentially demands are made. We demand that you, Byzantium, you convert to Islam and surrender your territories. And you can imagine the Byzantines sort of laughing about that and saying, who are these people making these outrageous demands? So they are the underdogs. But what I would stress is that I think the scholarship of the last several decades has gone a long way in demonstrating that they are not an incompetent fighting force. They are highly organized, these Muslims. They have extremely competent generalship. And they know how to fight in ways that are effective at all the different levels of war, from the tactical to the strategic. And so I think increasingly historians have become impressed with the military organization, discipline, and aptitude of these early Muslim forces. We know that their caliphs are competent. They had fought alongside Muhammad during the wars between Mecca and Medina in the previous decades. So they had combat experience. And the subordinate commanders are very, very good. So I think at the time they're underrated, certainly by the Byzantines, who have this long Roman tradition they can fall back on, and are to some degree surprised by the Muslim aptitude. And it gets particularly bad in 636 when they lose the major battle of Yarmouk, in which the Byzantine armies are just smashed apart by very competent Muslim commanders. And so I personally, as I was reading through these materials, came away with the same impression that this is an impressive military machine. It is in its early stages, but it seemed to have operated incredibly well.
And in Jerusalem at that time, Byzantines are out, the Muslims are in. Obviously, you had a diverse population of different religions, of different origins. What was that population like? And what was the new Islamic policy towards minorities, whether they were now Jews or Christians in Jerusalem?
Yes, it's Jerusalem is small at this time. We tend to, Jerusalem is a very important city, has always been a very important city, but for most of its history, it's also been a very small city. And the population, certainly in the Middle Ages, never exceeded 30,000 people. Not that I or anyone else has been able to tell. It's always been at that very small level. And it is a diverse population in the sense that you do have Christians, Jews, and people of other faiths, such as Zoroastrians, for example, who are in the city and who are living next to each other. Now, what we think is that when the Muslims initially come, the population is mostly Christian at that moment in time. And there's particular reasons for that. The wars against the Persians had led to a lot of acrimony. There's an accusation, and this is 20-some years before the Muslims arrived, that in the siege of 614, when the Persians attacked the city, that the local Jews were complicit in that attack, that they offered intelligence to the Persians, and that they participated in the execution of some Christians. So those accusations are sort of hanging over the city. And when the Byzantines retake the city under Emperor Heraclius, he essentially outlaws the Jews from the region. They're expelled from the city. They are formally persecuted. There's a lot of forced conversions and baptisms that go on. And so the Jewish population is really becomes minuscule, if noticeable at all, by the time the Muslims arrive. There's a story of Caliph Umar as he's riding into the city, and he encounters this random Jew walking along the road. So we know they're in the environment. They're definitely living there, but the Byzantines had really put the vice grips on them and were persecuting them at every step. So it's not, although traditionally a diverse city, I would not say it's particularly diverse by the time the Muslims arrive. And in the agreements, when Jerusalem is transferred over, when the local Christian patriarch surrenders the city to Caliph Umar, there's an agreement drawn up called Umar's Assurance, in which there's some swapping that goes on of territory. And Umar agrees that in exchange for possession of the city and for particular Muslim control of the Temple Mount, he agrees with the patriarch that to not persecute Christians in town and to not destroy their churches and to not to besmirch their religious rights. And if you look at the documents, Sophronius, the patriarch, he specifically requests from Umar that the Jews not be given any rights in Jerusalem. So in 638, when the city falls, there is a decided bent against any kind of Jewish presence in the town, and it's agreed to by Christians and Muslims. So the previous sort of diversity and tolerance withers away at that point with regard to the Jewish community. What's interesting is that Umar apparently changes his mind pretty soon after that agreement is written, because we spot Jewish residency in the city just within a few years of its fall. And so what the scholars of Islam have tried to argue for, and have, I think, made a pretty convincing case, is that Umar agrees to this exclusion of the Jews initially, and then realizes later that that's not a good idea, and changes his mind. And then, much to the chagrin of the Eastern Christians, the Jews are back in. And so you get this return to all three Abrahamic faiths living next to each other after it takes a little bit of a pause.
And during this period, how does Jerusalem become religiously significant for the Islamic world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And that's also one that's been hashed over a lot in the past decade, especially. Initially, Jerusalem appears to have had very little meaning to the Muslims, but then swiftly after adopts new meaning as the Qibla, as the direction of prayer. It goes from being a city which, as many have pointed out, is not actually named in the Quran. It's referred to, the future Alaska will be referred to as the farthest mosque, but the Quran doesn't actually name Jerusalem as a holy place, but the Hadith certainly do, the traditions of Muhammad. And on those traditions, what we know is that the original Muslim direction of prayer was towards the city of Jerusalem. So for a moment, it's very important because you have Muslims praying in that direction, praying towards the Temple Mount as the spot where Muhammad purportedly landed and ascended to heaven in his night journey. Very soon after that, though, it goes away. We know that the tradition of praying towards Jerusalem does not have a very long shelf life, and before long, Muslims are praying towards Mecca instead. So you've got this brief moment where Jerusalem seems to have this prominence. After that, it falls away, and then it's a question of, okay, how important then is Al-Aqsa? And then, Umar is going to fund the construction of the first mosque. Very soon after, Al-Aqsa will be constructed. The Dome of the Rock will be constructed on the Temple Mount. And you say, well, okay, those are important Islamic buildings, but what do we mean by that? How important? Historians of the 7th and 8th century have pointed out that even with the caliphs owning the city, and even with the movement from the first 4 caliphs to the so-called Umayyad dynasty later, and then into the Abbasid dynasty after that, which goes into the 13th century, at no point does any Muslim ruler make Jerusalem their capital. It never has that kind of importance in terms of a political place. That said, it retains an important spiritual consideration. And over time, as you move into the 8th, 9th, and then 10th centuries, the meaning of Al-Aqsa increases in importance. And there's different factors for that. One of them, I think, is fairly important, is a growing recognition of the Temple Mount's importance in terms of eschatology, in terms of last days, because the Islamic conception of the end of the world, it does indeed, the final conflict will take place on the Temple Mount, and there's a structure called the Dome of the Chain next to the Dome of the Rock where the judgment will happen. And so what medieval Arabists have been kind of teasing out of the sources is this growing recognition over the time that Jerusalem is really important in a theological sense. So it begins as that sort of the practicality, we're going to pray towards there. That goes away, it shifts to Mecca. And while Jerusalem will never eclipse Mecca or Medina in terms of importance, you have this multi-century growth where it begins to occupy a very important place in the medieval Muslim mind. And so it's really a story of, I think, of evolution of ideas and of presence in the city that is made possible by continuing Muslim occupation of the city. I mean, once they get the city in 638, it will be ruled by Muslims all the way up until the First Crusade. And so when you have that kind of time on your hands, it lends itself naturally to a lot of discussion, a lot of building, a lot of thinking, a lot of interpreting, and Jerusalem rises in importance during that period.
And during that period before the First Crusade, is Jerusalem physically built up? Is the population increase? Does it go back to the grandeur of the days of King Herod, who built magnificent structures all over the land of Israel?
No, I wouldn't push it that far. It's tough to measure up to the great builder, right? What I will say is it goes through swells, essentially. I mean, there are times where the city increases, and by this, of course, I haven't said this, but when I say the city, I am really referring to what we would call the old city today in modern Jerusalem, that circuit of walls. There are times where the walls are lengthened, and the city expands to occupy areas like the old city of David, to particularly south by Mount Zion, to build out the walls and to incorporate larger pieces of the city in. And then other times those walls are broken through and you have a contraction of the city. Inside the city, there's a lot of events that involve the building and destruction of certain buildings. So it's difficult to say whether there are times where you might say, well, it becomes impressive and beautiful. which is great. But in the year 1009, the Caliph of Egypt destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so you have this Christian foundation that was built up over centuries, and it's reduced to nothingness and then has to be rebuilt. Al-Aqsa Mosque goes through several moments because of earthquakes, simply natural phenomenon where Umar's original mosque is destroyed, another one is built, it's destroyed by an earthquake, it's rebuilt, here comes another earthquake that not only damages the mosque but also part of the walls of the city. And so there are those kinds of those swells where it goes up and down, and it's very I would say sort of complete. The buildings are all in good repair, you have a flourishing population, and then in other times things happen, buildings are destroyed, and the population changes because of the changing landscape. One thing I write about in the book that I found interesting was at one point in the 11th century, things are getting dicey enough within the city that that one of the Muslim law schools decides to pack up and leave. And they say, look, things are just getting a little tough. We're going to move to Tyre. We're just going to move the whole school and the operation to Tyre. And they actually reach out to the Jewish yeshiva at the same time and say, hey, do you want to come with us? No, why don't we both relocate? Because Jerusalem is not a great place right now. And they agree. And you have this strange phenomenon of Jewish and Muslim scholars picking up, moving to another city and transferring their operations. So the city goes through periods like that, as well as with the normal sieges. People, when they see an army approaching, they tend not to want to stick around, so they'll leave and go off to greener pastures. But even in all of those swells, you never get a huge boom in the population. You are talking about shifts between, I would say, in this period, between 15,000, 22,000 people, and it'll go up and down, something like that. But there's never a moment where you just have this massive boom. And I think that another aspect of that, a question you asked earlier that I neglected to answer. Jerusalem really is not a well-placed strategic city. It's off the major trade routes. It holds very little military value in terms of where you would want to occupy cities to dominate territory. It's in the hills. It's not well watered. It's not a fantastic place that you would dream of living unless you are really into those religious connections. Much better, much more attractive are cities like Caesarea or Tyre or Tripoli, or even places after the 10th century like Cairo, that are these wonderful bustling metropolises. And it's no surprise that that's where people want to live. That's where they want to hang out. And Jerusalem just remains kind of small and off the beaten track.
Okay. So, as you mentioned, obviously the first crusade, who were the first crusaders? What was the impetus behind the crusade? And what was their military strategy as they moved across Europe into the Levant, the Middle East?
So two of those are relatively easy to answer, and one of them is very difficult. Okay. In terms of who they are, we only have the names of a couple hundred actual crusaders. So putting faces to the whole army is difficult, but we can say, broadly speaking, where these contingents are coming from. It's an expeditionary army that we would call today, I suppose, multinational in a sense. There were no nations at the time, but from France, from the Holy Roman Empire, from the Low Countries, and southern Italy, predominantly from those four regions. Disparate groups of people who have decided to go to war for God, who have decided to become, as we call it, cruce signatus, signed by the cross, where you stitch a little cross onto your clothing and dedicate yourself to a holy quest, essentially. And the idea is that these groups would come together, and they coalesce in the city of Constantinople. It's sort of one of their first rally points. They receive assistance from the Byzantine Empire, and then the strategy is to march straight into the heart of Turkish power in the Levant and take the city of Jerusalem. And there's been some argument about, well, is Jerusalem their only target? Are they also looking at other things? And they clearly are. One of the Crusade leaders, Bohemond, He never makes it to Jerusalem because he chooses to grab the city of Antioch for himself. And so there are these lesser targets, but the strategy is essentially one of invasion and siege and fighting battles where you need to, but it's occupation of territory. And it's very clear from the Crusade propaganda that's out there. The claim is that this is Christian land. This is land that was Christian under the old Roman empires. It had been taken away from Christian control by the Muslims, and so this is a move to regain land that belongs to us. That's the idea. Conveniently forgotten in that, as pointed out by many people, is that there is another people who actually had an earlier claim to this land, those being the Jews. And so in the propaganda of the piece, and it ties very much into strong theological rivers running really ever since the 3rd century, maybe even earlier, of this sort of what I call the disinheritance of the Jews, which has to take place first. The Jews no longer have a claim because of these accusations of what was called Christ killing at the time. They lose their claim, therefore the land becomes Christian. So that means it belongs to Christendom, and the Muslims are just the latest speed bump occupying that territory. And it's time to go and actually grab it all back. It's a very idealistic, religiously charged campaign. Now, so that's the who, and that's the strategy. Now, in terms of why exactly they go, what the impetus is, I wish I could give you the answer, but there's something like 10 or 11 different answers that Crusade historians argue incessantly about. There is no consensus on what it is. There are dominant schools of thought. So, for example, I think still the dominant school of thought is that they're going because of Jerusalem, right? It's the call of Jerusalem, as well as the so-called call from the east. The Byzantines have issued a request for military assistance. The Emperor of Byzantium reaches out to his counterparts in Europe and offers them and says, if you will come and help me fight to defend my own lands against the Turkish presence, so to defend Byzantium, the capital of Constantinople within it, then I will reward you, and then also, you have the opportunity to retake Jerusalem while you're out there. And those are the main reasons that have been given, but there's so many others. There's the cynical one that wants to say, well, it's greed, it's money, it's opportunism. The evidence for that is not great. There's the apocalyptic approach, which I studied, and my dissertation advisor was very big on this, and so I'm somewhat influenced by it. That many of these Christians honestly believed that by retaking Jerusalem, they would bring about the final judgment. And so they're on an eschatological quest. Other explanations may be that maybe they're not thinking about the end of the world so much, but about themselves and their own fate in the afterlife. So this is the crusading as an indulgence, right? So if you fight meritorious warfare for God, you will be forgiven your sins, speeding your entry into heaven. There is one school that says it's almost pure anti-Judaism. That really you can cut through a lot of these things by saying this is that disinheritance piece. And the Crusade starts off with pogroms against the Jews in the Rhineland. And so there's a proximate cause for you, that they're really doing this in this kind of centuries old struggle against the tribes of Israel, the Jewish people, however they were conceived. So those are some of the biggies. And there are others. Boredom is a great one. You'll hear sometimes that the church had clamped down on local warfare in Europe, and it wasn't allowing the Christians to fight against each other, and they needed an outlet for their anger. And so they go on crusades because essentially they're bored. There's a whole host of them. I tell my students, I say, if anyone tells you there's one cause for the crusade, then they're being disingenuous or they're just ignorant. And if someone suggests, is this a cause for the crusade? The best answer is to say, sure. Yeah, that's a cause of the crusade, along with probably all of these other things.
And how does this army, a collection of, this United Nations force, cross Europe, get to the Middle East. And as you described before, the Muslims were powerful militarily. How do they succeed? What was their strategy, and how do they do it?
It's frankly, it's a wonder that they ever did. And I think one of the lures of the First Crusade, there seems to be like there's a new book on it every couple of years. People are perpetually fascinated by it. I think it's because it's so incredible that it actually worked. You're talking about groups of soldiers, contingents of armies that had no one clear leader from the beginning, what we in the Army would call unity of command. You don't have it. You have several leaders who squabble amongst themselves, argue and fight about the best course of action. You have them taking different paths through Asia Minor and popping out on the other side after fighting battles and running out of food and getting lost and not knowing the way to go. They are, according to the Crusade Chronicles, they're betrayed by their Byzantine allies at Antioch. The Byzantines pull their troops, and they pull some of their logistics and sustainment. And over time, the Crusaders find themselves suffering through tremendous deprivation. They almost starved to death as a group in the city of Antioch in the winter of 1098. They lose practically all of their horses at Antioch because they have to eat them for food. And as they move forward, they are whittled down from a group that may have numbered 60, 70,000 people at the outset. By the time they get to Jerusalem, there's probably no more than 12,000 left. And it may have been even smaller. So you have this rump from the original force that's set out. From attrition, from exposure, starvation, battle, and then also people desert. There's some famous stories of even Crusade leaders who run away in the middle of the Crusade. It's too daunting. It's too terrifying. And they're also proceeding through this land without good maps and without a lot of local knowledge, not speaking the languages of the locals, and fighting against, as you noted, these hordes really of Turks. Multiple Turkish armies who had been very successful in their own ways, who have occupied all of the major cities. So the fact that they got to Jerusalem is it's just a little short of miraculous. The fact that they were able to hold this thing together and then at length break into the city and actually take the city of Jerusalem against a pretty well-stocked garrison that had been left there by the Egyptians. So I don't know. And this is given the nature of the source material, which often kind of goes silent on issues that we would like to know more about. We don't know the entire narrative of how they got there. We don't know what happened at every step along the way. We just know that they eventually did. And so it's amazing that the whole enterprise didn't fall apart by itself. And you can see even from the outcome of the crusade, once Jerusalem falls and once the combat is over, most of the fighters go home. There's very few that actually stay in the Levant, and that's indicative of the same kind of problems you have on campaign. How do you convince soldiers to go and risk their lives? How do you keep them in the fight? And then how do you convince them to stay around to create this new Christian land in the East? It's a very difficult thing. And so I'm always amazed by the First Crusade. It should have failed at multiple points. But it's one of those odd historical occurrences where there's enough luck, enough happenstance, they take enough chances at the right time, and somehow they got through.
As you mentioned, in Jewish history, the Crusades decimated Jewish communities, thriving Jewish communities, centers of learning that's still a part of Jewish liturgy today. Once they controlled Jerusalem, what was the relationship of the new Christian kingdom in Jerusalem vis-a-vis Muslims and Jews?
It's pretty awful at the beginning, frankly, but perhaps not as broad-based awful as one might think. In Jerusalem, during the sack of the city following the siege, there was a massacre that was carried out. This again I think will always be perpetually argued about how many people died in Jerusalem. But we know that a synagogue is burned down with Jews inside, deliberately so. We know that the Muslim population is largely put to the sword, and there's a moment on the second day of the sack where even women and children who had been given safe conduct are butchered on the Temple Mount. And as the cleaning goes up after the sack, what we figured out is that most Muslims and Jews who have survived are expelled from the city. They are no longer welcome to reside or even be in the city of Jerusalem. Some of them stuck around. There's an argument that some Muslims stuck around as slaves for a while. That's been a little contentious. For the Jews, the ones who have survived seem to have been used as hostages, and they're eventually exchanged for money with family and friends in places like Cairo. And so they're spirited out. And we only know that because there's some letters from the Cairo Geniza. We have some Geniza documents that talk about these individuals and arranging payments and that sort of thing. But aside from those few souls, Jerusalem becomes a Christian theocracy for, as far as I've been able to tell, about 19 years. About 19 years. There is only a Christian presence in the city. Now, I mentioned it maybe not as broad-based as that. If you look around the Levant, there are Jews in other cities. The laws that were imposed that outlawed Jewish and Muslim residents do not seem to have been applied in the other cities. So you see Jewish communities in Tyre. You see them along the Levantine coast. You even see them on the interior and in some villages around Jerusalem, but not in the holy city itself. And that was a very deliberate thing. And that's, you can owe that to a lot of things. That I think you're seeing the zealotry of these Crusade participants, of the new ecclesiastics who were installed in office after the sack. They do not want these people in town. The problem is, as I mentioned, that Jerusalem was never a big town anyway. So what happens if you only have Christians living there? Well, most of the Crusaders went back home to the West. The Eastern Christians are not exactly jazzed by the idea of living here because some of them had died during the sack. And soon you realize that if there's no people in town, it's kind of hard to run a city. So for those first couple decades, there's no market in Jerusalem. There's literally no place to go and buy goods because there's not enough people to participate in the market. And who's going to buy and sell? Well, the sellers are going to be the locals, which means you're talking about Muslims and Jews who would normally be there selling things. And so after a while, the first detection I found of other non-Christians being back in the city was in 1119, where you start to see Muslims in the sources. They start to pop up again. You see them in the funeral for King Baldwin I when he dies. Apparently there's Muslim mourners in the city. And then soon after that, they're changing the laws so that Muslim traders get their taxes and tariffs reduced, because apparently it was very expensive to buy and sell if you're a Muslim merchant. And they dropped the tariffs, which told me, well, then they must have been in the city being taxed for you to reduce the taxes, right? So by the 1120s, Muslims are back in town. They're back trading. I wish we knew more about how many are there, how active are they trading, and are they just visiting for the day? Like, do they have to leave at the end of the day? Do they have to go away? Or are they able to reside, to actually take up lodging? And those details, unfortunately, are just not great. And so we don't really know. What we do know is that by 1130, Muslims are back worshiping on the Temple Mount, which is one of the most surprising things I found in the course of my research. First, the elites, and I tell the story about one of the local diplomats who apparently knew the Christians, had an audience with the king, he calls the Knights Templar his friends. He's worshiping right outside Al-Aqsa. And then another account that says by the 1140s, you have whole groups of Muslims worshiping right outside the Dome of the Rock to the south. So Muslims make their comeback steadily. And this is only a Christian theocracy for maybe 2 decades tops, and it may have been less than that. Jews, unfortunately, are harder to detect. We don't start seeing them again until the 1160s. So you have to go a couple more decades after the Muslim return to really get evidence of them living there. And even then, the numbers are so scanty. There's a traveling rabbi named Benjamin of Tudela who writes this very famous itinerary where he visits all these places and counts Jewish families every city he goes to. So demographically, it's a fantastic source. He writes that there were only 4 Jews in Jerusalem when he arrived. Now, scholars like Joshua Prower, who have gone into that and said, well, it probably means 4 Jewish families, not just 4 individual Jews. Oh, okay, 4 Jewish extended families, but that's not a lot of people. And again, they're not purchasing property. They're not, acquiring houses for themselves. They're renting, and their movements are highly controlled. But a bit more promising is, along with that Jewish residency, we've got the Muslims worshiping on the Temple Mount by the 1130s. It seems like the Jews are actively worshiping at the Western Wall as early as the 1180s, and maybe even a little earlier than that. Now, that is a hugely controversial and political thing that I just said. There are a lot of scholars out there who have worked very hard to deny that there's any Jewish prayer at the Western Wall in the 12th century at all. And instead, the way they would read the documents is that the Jews would be located on the Mount of Olives, facing towards the Temple Mount, but they're not actually on, in front of Herod's wall. I disagree with them. I think that's an ongoing debate that will go on and on. And I probably don't have to tell you that links into modern political controversies, because if you want to make the argument that the Jews have the right to pray at the wall, part of that is the historical component. Well, they have been praying at the wall since, and then you have to fill in the blank, right? Well, since when? I think it's the 12th century. Others want to place that later. But for all intents and purposes, before the 12th century is over, I think for sure you have Jews and Muslims residing in Jerusalem, and they are being allowed to do so by the local Christian leaders, which means those laws prohibiting them they've either been overturned or they're being ignored for practicality's sake. But you're once again back to that more diverse population.
Okay. And now the Christian kingdom comes to its end. Based on what you said, it doesn't sound so surprising. You've got this motley group of people, some stay, some don't stay. It's kind of like not surprising that you find that in 1187, Crusaders lose control. How do they lose control of the city? Who takes over? And now how does that new regime, the new controllers, deal with Christians, Jews, and other groups?
Right. In 1187, the city is lost to the army of Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt. They had seen this coming. The armies of what we call the Crusader states had been fighting against Saladin and his predecessors for some time. And in 1187, it all falls apart. And the reason for this is that the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem loses its field army. I very much believe this is a result of military action. At the Battle of Hattin in July 1187, the army of Jerusalem is essentially destroyed. Up to 20,000 Christian soldiers are killed. The leaders are captured or executed. The remnants kind of run off to the Levantine coastline, and the army is gone. And that army is the principal thing protecting the city of Jerusalem. And so once it's gone, Saladin can march on the city. He can besiege the city and take essentially as long as he wants to get in, and which he does. He does undermine the wall with they have what we call sappers. They tunnel under the wall and they collapse part of it. The local Crusade leaders surrender, and Muslim occupation of the city resumes. So for, it's a long story of Muslim occupation of Jerusalem. It's only interrupted by 88 years of Christian presence after the First Crusade, less than a century, and the Muslims are back. And when he returns, he reinstitutes some things in the city that have been traditionally seen as notable in terms of religious toleration. I tend to look at them as more of an evolution from what the Christians were already doing. Very famously, he sort of opened the door to the Jews and invited them back, which is a policy change, right? It's different than just tolerating a Jewish presence. It's actually courting a community and saying, why don't you return? He gives religious rights to the Christians who are still in the city, the Eastern Christians and Western Christians. But probably more decisive is his move to firmly establish Jerusalem as a Muslim holy city again, which means a lot of building of mosques, madrasa, all of them funded through walks, through endowments, so that they continue to operate. The stripping of all the Christian material additions to the Temple Mount. So that means going into the Dome of the Rock and pulling down the statues off the walls and the paintings off the walls, and getting rid of the altar and whatnot, and reestablishing buildings like this as Muslim places of worship. And so Saladin is really kind of that critical moment, and he's been celebrated as doing it rather differently than the Crusaders did. He has a choice, and the Arabic sources testify that he considered the option of conducting a massacre just like they had in 1099, and he decides to pass on that. Instead, he accepts the ransom for the Jerusalem population and then sells the rest of them into slavery. And so it's always fun with my students. We go down that road and say, okay, so Saladin's not as bad as the Crusaders, but I don't know that mass slavery is is it better? What do you think? I throw it to the students and I let them kick that around as an ethical question. I also, argue in the book that there is evidence of a mass rape committed by the Muslim soldiers against the Jerusalem population after the siege, which kind of gets skirted over by a lot of his biographers because it's an unpleasant thing to talk about. But in general, I would say that Saladin comes out of it with a pretty good reputation, and the general thought is that the city, which has traditionally been looked at as intolerant and not diverse, has now returned to its roots of being a place where all religions can practice next to each other. That's the standard narrative. In my book, I absolutely challenge that and say, no, he's riding on the heels of 50 or 60 years of a very gradual return to that kind of pluralism. But he really does put the stamp on it.
But Saladin is based out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, you have a significant, at least Jewish population in Egypt, in Cairo, that's really part and parcel of society. Physicians, obviously, to the royal court. Is there a Christian population in Fustat, in Cairo at that time, that's also part of society? And hence, maybe that kind of thinking, transfers over to Jerusalem as well.
Yeah, there is a Christian presence there. And I think you're absolutely right that Saladin is, and I would say not only, he's a Kurd, he's from Mesopotamia. He had experience in Syria before he went down to Egypt, and he becomes the Lord of Syria as well. I think everywhere you look in the Muslim world, you have lots of examples of the Abrahamic faiths living together. And I think it would not be hard for him to say, well, look, here in Fustat, in Alexandria, in Tyre, in Caesarea, in Damascus, in these other places, you do have diverse communities. Now, is that his main inspiration? I'm not sure, but certainly that's a model he could work off of. What I do point out in the book is that I think Jerusalem's a little bit unique. If you look at other major cities in the region over the centuries of the Middle Ages, you see much more intolerance of other religions than in Jerusalem. So, for example, in Baghdad, I would not have wanted to be a Jew or Christian living in medieval Baghdad at various moments. There are some times where it's not so bad, but what I've discovered in my research, and I think I found the earliest example of this, the very first example of people being forced to wear distinctive items of clothing and jewelry to distinguish themselves from Muslims, was in Baghdad in the 800s. For black clothing for Jews, huge crosses worn around the neck of Christians, like yokes that would bend their heads down. The same thing happens in Cairo under Caliph al-Hakim. Very purposeful identification of people of different faiths so that they could be discriminated against. And there's a lot of that, and there's the subject of dimitude and how Muslims treat conquered populations has been a huge and very controversial area of studies. And what I point out is that I see Jerusalem as not that. Not saying it's an oasis of tranquil, peaceful, diverse communities getting along. It's not. It has its problems. But compared to some other places, I think the interfaith life is much better in the Holy City, which I think is a very curious notion, because it sort of goes against the way we want to think and think, well, in the city with the holy places, that must be where there must be the most strife. And I found that's not necessarily the case. So it could be that he's modeling Cairo or modeling some other city. I think there's a practical aspect to all of this. If you want a thriving community, if you want a prosperous community with markets that you can tax, that you can control well, then you need to let in the locals. And the locals here are Eastern Christians, Muslim, and Jews. It just makes sense to have them involved in the story.
And after the Saladin dynasty, we come upon which group is now controlling Jerusalem and for how long?
So you have, for a long time, all the way into the 13th century, you have the Saladin's descendants, the so-called Ayyubid dynasty of Egypt ruling in Jerusalem. Over the course of Ayyubid rule, there are some very interesting transitions that happen. Because the Ayyubids themselves, unlike Saladin, who was this solitary ruler that everybody respected and everybody followed, once he's dead, there are huge arguments among his family as to who should have what. And you have one branch of the Ayyubid family ruling in Egypt, but you have another branch ruling in Damascus. And they are very frequently at war with each other as much as they are with the Latin Christians in the area. So Jerusalem gets tossed around a little bit. It becomes a pawn in the larger political scene. At various moments, it's offered as a prize. So, for example, during the Fifth Crusade, during the 12 teens, the Crusaders are fighting in Egypt, and they're made an offer by the Sultan there: if you leave Egypt, I'll give you Jerusalem. You can have it. At the time, Jerusalem didn't even belong to him. It belonged to his relatives from the Damascus branch of the family. And so it becomes a pawn, like a lot of other things in the larger politics of the time. I think undoubtedly the most interesting development during Ayyubid rule is the what we refer to as the Sixth Crusade, the coming of Emperor Frederick II to the city, when the Holy Roman Empire gains the crown of Jerusalem. And that's during the reign of Saladin's descendants, where there's this extraordinary deal worked out in 1229 between Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Al-Kamil, who is the Sultan of Egypt. They come to an agreement about the city of Jerusalem to essentially split it between them, where most of the city remains in Christian hands and is ruled by Christians. Although there may be Muslims and Jews living there, it's going to be dominated by politically by Christians. But the Temple Mount goes to Muslims. That agreement is worked out where it's exclusivity of Muslim prayer on the Temple Mount. And they work that out as a political solution between themselves. And we may get into this further later, but and I've argued that deal essentially forms the core of what we deal with in modern times when you're looking at divisions of the city and the so-called status quo and agreements over who owns what, who can pray where. That sort of sets the stage for it. So even in this time of a lot of political disunification and chaos, you've got these interesting interfaith accords that are happening. Of course, the problem is that not everybody likes those kinds of arrangements. And by the time you get to the 1240s, you have a more zealous group of Muslims called the Khwarezmians, who are essentially bought as a mercenary ally group by the Egyptians. And in 1244, they sack the city and they destroy all kinds of those Christian foundations and slaughter something like 6,000 of the residents. And so once again, Jerusalem kind of hits this nadir where the walls are gone. the population's been slaughtered, tremendous religious disunification. And so it's a very tumultuous period, the 13th century. I'll add as one final thought is the outcome of that 1244 sacking of the city is absolutely remarkable. The result of it is one of the least known, I think, multicultural military alliances in history, where the Christians, including the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, form a military alliance with groups of Muslims from Kerak and Homs and Damascus. They form this multi-faith alliance to fight against these Muslim zealots. And you actually see, like, before the army sets off, you see the sign of the cross, and you see baptisms, and you've got Muslim rulers, and they all ride into battle together, and unfortunately for them, lose against the Muslim zealots. And so it's a very short-lived interfaith alliance. But the fact that it happens at all tells you a little bit about the period. That these are pretty crazy times after the death of Saladin.
And this takes us into the Mamluk rule. Is that how the book concludes with that dynasty?
Yeah, with the Mamluk rule, because you have King Louis IX of France, who we refer to as Saint Louis, the only canonized king of France, is a crusading king. He fights on 2 crusades. And the first one is the 7th Crusade, which he directs to Egypt. He leaves Cyprus with a fleet and sails to the Egyptian coastline and tries to fight his way towards Cairo. While he's doing that, while he's in Egypt, this is at the late, he launches a crusade. This is 1248, 1249, 1250. While he's there, the Ayyubid dynasty collapses, and the Mamluks seize control of very, very interesting political and sly ways, seize control of Egypt, and you have the beginning of this Mamluk period, right? And it's under the Mamluks that all remaining presence of the Crusader states is wiped away in the Levant. Jerusalem falls under Mamluk control. The last Crusade fortresses and cities in the region are taken one by one by these Mamluk armies. The final one to fall, the modern city of Akko, medieval Acre, falls in 1291 to Mamluk forces, and that's all she wrote for the crusading enterprise. That's the end of their rule in the Levant specifically. They remain in Cyprus and Rhodes and in the Mediterranean islands, but they've essentially been driven off the mainland. And the Mamluks are very interesting because while they're doing this, they're defeating the Latin Christians on one hand, grabbing Jerusalem for themselves again and reestablishing Muslim rule up and down the coast, while with the other hand, they're fighting against the Mongols, who are streaming in from Central Asia. And so the Mamluks are one of these, I don't think they're written about nearly enough, one of these most capable states in the medieval Middle East, who are trouncing everyone they come into contact with.
And they're from where? Mamluks are from where?
They erupt out of Egypt. Originally. They're slave soldiers who had been around Egypt for centuries. But they come out of Egypt, and you have Mamluk armies streaming as far to the east as India. So there's disparate groups all over the place. And it's under Mamluk rule that Jerusalem becomes firmly a Muslim city once again, and it will not lose that designation really until you get to the British Mandate. It will extend all the way into the 20th century as a Muslim city. But as I point out, even then, it's a Muslim-controlled city, but with members of all 3 Abrahamic faiths living and worshiping next door to each other. And when the Mamluks give way to the Ottomans actually confirm all of these religious rights in a series of decrees. It's where the absolute Jewish right to the Western Wall is decreed by an Ottoman sultan. I mean, he draws it up in law and says it's yours. No one will interfere with it. And so that's where I kind of break off the book, is I say, well, okay, well, we're no longer going to see shifts between the religions anymore. It's a Muslim game now, all the way until the 20th century, and I'm not a 20th century historian, so I had no desire to pursue the story all the way.
As you mentioned throughout the discussion, the phenomenon of the 3 faiths if not getting along, at least coming to some kind of modus operandi of reconciliation, of a division, of whatever it might be. You write in the book that in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in 1967, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, who's credited by many for the Six-Day victory, makes a decision and hands or keeps the keys to the Temple Mount in Muslim control. How do you view that historically? That it is a new precedent, or as I think you have argued, that it's really something that's found and it's a continuation of what we see in history, in medieval history?
I think it absolutely is building off of the medieval tradition. And I think you can bring it back. I mentioned Frederick II. I think that's where you have kind of the agreement in its concrete form. But I think you could even pull it back to the days of Umar in the early 7th century. This agreement of the concept that there can be sectors in the city in which adherents of one faith operate versus adherents of another. That I think that is a trend you see. It only really takes a break during those first 2 decades of Crusader rule. After the First Crusade, at all other times, you have people worshiping sort of where they like in the city. And so Dayan's action, I just find to be fascinating. And I know it's controversial because there's arguments about what Rabbi Goren said when he was there. This is actually, this is our time, detonate these buildings and we can end this forever. I know there's an argument about whether he actually said that or not and what Dayan's reacting against. But if you look in Dayan's memoirs, he's kicking back to these concepts of the status quo. This is the way it has been. We're going to keep it the way it has been. And certainly there's some who can question that and say, well, okay, that's the way it's been. Is this the time to break tradition? Maybe this is time to go another direction. But he seems to very much be keying in on a heritage piece there. Now, what I don't know, and I would know more if I was a historian of the 20th century and could pursue these things, and I hope somebody would take this up someday. I don't know anything about Dayan's personal education, knowledge of history. Had he read about the Middle Ages? Did he know about these older precedents? I'm sure he knew about the more recent ones from the late 19th into the early 20th century, and certainly knows about the problems of the 48 War and the things coming before. Does he know anything about the medieval experience? I have no idea. I hope somebody will tell me about that if he did or not. But my contention is the book is that it's in my gut that not a lot of people know much about that full medieval story. So it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't, and he was simply going off of more recent developments in the city. I think medieval Jerusalem is probably the least studied and understood period of the city's history. The Ottomanists, the people studying the Ottoman Empire, have done an awful lot of work on Jerusalem. And obviously the ancient Jerusalem piece is, I think that's probably gotten most of the attention, right? From the biblical foundations and the depredations of the Romans, among others, in relation to the city. I think with the Middle Ages, people know about the First Crusade, and Umar is heavily discussed in Muslim communities, and he and Saladin are seen as kind of these two founding heroes. But between Umar, Saladin, and the First Crusade, I don't know how much is regularly known, read about, and talked about in the medieval period. These are not hot topics. They're not people saying, I really want to bulk up on my 8th century Jerusalem history this summer. You don't really get much of that. So in my interpretation, I think he's very much acting as in a long line of political leaders who made a calculation that some measure of tolerance and sharing of holy sites is a prudent thing to do. I think he's in that line. And just like Umar and Saladin and the Crusaders and everybody else, it's left. I have the luxury of being a historian, and I can leave it to people to say, well, you tell me if that was a good idea or a bad idea or smart or unwise. I can kind of leave that up to the readers.
Well, I think after this discussion, we will have listeners and viewers who will say this really is a hot topic, and urge them to go online and purchase Professor Hosler's Fall of Jerusalem over the 7 centuries. And again, we've just touched on one period and only parts of one period. A fascinating topic and avoided getting into any political issues, which is always good.
Excellent.
Which is always good. It's pure history. We'll leave, the conclusions, the political conclusions to others. And again, Professor Hosler, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. It's fantastic being here. Thank you.